Hey everyone. Tonight we begin with something that sounds almost too bizarre to be true. A world where identity was fluid, where a clever tongue and convincing backstory could elevate a commoner to the throne of kings. We're diving deep into the shadowy realm of royal imposters, those audacious souls who dared to claim crowns that were never theirs, and somehow, against all odds, made the world believe them. So before you settle in for the night, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we drift into these forgotten corners of history. Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in an age before photographs, before fingerprints, before any reliable way to verify someone's identity beyond their word and the testimony of those who claimed to know them. In this world, a person's entire existence could be reinvented with nothing more than a compelling story and the confidence to tell it convincingly. This was the reality that allowed some of history's most audacious fraudsters to not just claim royal blood, but to actually wear crowns, command armies, and rule over thousands of subjects who believed every word of their carefully constructed lies. What most people don't realize is that medieval and early modern Europe was absolutely riddled with these royal pretenders. Men and women who showed up at court claiming to be long-lost princes, presumed dead princesses, or legitimate heirs to disputed thrones. Some were obvious frauds who were quickly exposed and executed. Others were so convincing, so thoroughly prepared, that they managed to fool entire kingdoms for years. And then there were those whose true identities remain mysteries to this day, leaving historians to wonder whether they were brilliant con artists or perhaps, just perhaps, the real deal after all. Tonight, we're going to explore the fascinating world of these royal imposters, beginning with one of the most successful and enigmatic pretenders in European history. A man who convinced powerful nobles, foreign kings, and even his supposed aunt that he was the rightful heir to the English throne. His story begins in the bustling port city of Cork, Ireland, in the year 1491, when a young man with an extraordinary tale would set in motion events that would shake the very foundations of the Tudor dynasty. But before we dive into that remarkable story, let's understand the world that made such deceptions possible. This was an era when communication traveled at the speed of horseback, when news could take weeks or months to cross national borders, and when the death or disappearance of a royal could create power vacuums that ambitious pretenders were all too eager to fill. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were particularly ripe for such imposters, as wars, political upheavals, and dynastic disputes had left numerous throne claims in doubt, and several royal children mysteriously vanished. The art of royal impersonation required far more than simply claiming a noble bloodline. Successful pretenders needed to master the intricate details of court life, the genealogies of royal families, the political alliances and enmities that shaped kingdoms, and most importantly, the mannerisms and education that would convince skeptical nobles of their authenticity. They had to speak multiple languages, understand heraldry, know the intimate details of royal households they claimed to have grown up in, and possess the kind of refined bearing that could only come from years of aristocratic upbringing. Or so it seemed. The reality was that many of these imposters were remarkably ordinary people who had somehow acquired extraordinary knowledge about royal life, often through servants, displaced nobles, or others who had inside access to the courts they sought to infiltrate. Some had been carefully groomed for years by political enemies of the current regime, taught every detail they would need to play their part convincingly. Others were natural charismatic individuals who combined quick wit with careful observation to build their false identities piece by piece. The consequences of being exposed as a royal imposter were typically swift and brutal. Most ended their days on the executioner's block, their heads displayed as warnings to others who might harbor similar ambitions. Yet, despite these risks, the potential rewards were so enormous that desperate or ambitious individuals continued to try their luck at claiming thrones throughout this period. The successful imposter could expect not just a crown, but vast wealth, political power, and the ability to reshape the fate of nations. What makes these stories particularly fascinating is how they reveal the fluid nature of identity in an age before modern documentation. Royal legitimacy itself was often contested, with multiple claimants to the same throne basing their arguments on different interpretations of inheritance laws, marriage contracts, or political agreements. In such an environment, a convincing imposter could sometimes present a more compelling case for legitimacy than the actual occupant of the throne. The psychology of those who supported these pretenders is equally intriguing. Why would experienced nobles, foreign diplomats, and even members of royal families themselves be taken in by these elaborate deceptions? Part of the answer lies in wishful thinking. Many supporters genuinely wanted to believe that their preferred claimant had somehow survived against all odds. Others were motivated by political opportunism, seeing support for a pretender as a way to advance their own interests or strike back at enemies. Still, others may have had genuine doubts about the legitimacy of the current ruler, making them more receptive to alternative claims. The most successful royal imposters understood that their greatest asset was not their physical resemblance to the person they claimed to be, but their ability to embody the hopes and dreams of those who opposed the current regime. They became living symbols of political resistance, religious reformation, or dynastic restoration. In this role, their actual identity mattered less than what they represented to their supporters. This brings us to the remarkable story of Lambert Simnel, whose brief but spectacular career as a royal pretender would demonstrate just how far a clever deception could go in the volatile political landscape of late medieval England. Born around 1477, Simnel was the son of an organ maker, a humble craftsman whose boy would one day be crowned King of Ireland and lead an army against the Tudor King of England. The story begins with Richard Simmons, a priest with ambitious dreams and intimate knowledge of the complex dynastic disputes that had torn England apart during the Wars of the Roses. Simmons recognized in the young Simnel not just physical potential, but the kind of quick intelligence and natural charisma that could be molded into something extraordinary. What happened next would depend entirely on Simon's ability to transform this ordinary boy into a convincing member of the royal House of York. The plan that Simons conceived was breathtakingly audacious. He would claim that Simnel was actually Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, and therefore the legitimate heir to the English throne according to Yorkist claims. The real Edward was supposedly imprisoned in the Tower of London by Henry VII, but Simons would claim that the boy had been secretly rescued and was now ready to reclaim his birthright. The choice of Edward of Warwick as the identity to assume was strategically brilliant. As the son of Clarence, who had been executed for treason by his own brother Edward IV, the Earl of Warwick represented both royal legitimacy and tragic martyrdom. Many Yorkist supporters viewed him as the rightful king, unjustly denied his throne by the upstart Tudor dynasty. Moreover, the real Edward had been kept in such seclusion that few people outside the tower had any clear memory of what he looked like, making physical impersonation more feasible. Simons began Simnel's transformation with intensive education in royal etiquette, genealogy, and the intimate details of Yorkist family history. The boy learned to carry himself with aristocratic bearing, to speak with the refined accent of the nobility, and to demonstrate familiarity with people and places he had never actually encountered. More importantly, he learned to embody the righteous indignation of a prince wrongfully denied his inheritance, a performance that would prove crucial to winning over potential supporters. The priest's training regimen was comprehensive and relentless. Simnel studied heraldry until he could identify and explain the significance of dozens of noble coats of arms. He memorized the genealogies of English royal and noble families going back generations, learning not just names and dates, but the personal relationships, alliances, and feuds that shaped aristocratic society. He practiced the formal ceremonies and protocols of royal court life, learning when to bow, how to address different ranks of nobility, and the subtle signals that communicated royal authority. Perhaps most importantly, Simons taught his protege the art of selective memory. When questioned about his supposed childhood or family connections, Simnel learned to respond with just enough detail to seem authentic, while claiming that traumatic experiences or the natural passage of time had clouded certain recollections. This technique allowed him to avoid contradictions while maintaining an air of genuine uncertainty that made his story more believable. The physical transformation was equally important. Simnel's diet, exercise, and grooming were carefully managed to give him the well-fed, refined appearance expected of nobility. His clothing, though not yet royal in quality, was upgraded to reflect aristocratic status. His posture and movement were corrected until he naturally carried himself with the unconscious authority that marked those born to command. As news of the supposed Earl of Warwick's survival began to spread through underground networks of Yorkist sympathizers, Simons carefully managed the flow of information to build anticipation and credibility. Rather than immediately presenting Simnel publicly, he allowed rumors to circulate, letting supporters convince themselves of the story's truth before any direct evidence was presented. This psychological preparation proved crucial to the warm reception that would greet the pretender when he finally emerged into public view. The choice of Ireland as the launching point for this elaborate deception was strategically sound. The Irish nobility had never fully accepted Tudor rule and remained sympathetic to Yorkist claims. Moreover, Ireland's distance from London meant that fewer people would have personal knowledge of the real Edward of Warwick's appearance or mannerisms. The Irish political elite were predisposed to support any credible challenge to Henry VII's authority, making them ideal initial supporters for the pretender's cause. When Simons finally brought Simnel to Ireland in 1487, the response exceeded even the priest's optimistic expectations. Irish nobles, who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike back at Tudor rule, rallied to the supposed Earl with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. Here, at last, was their chance to support a legitimate alternative to the hated English king. The Earl of Kildare, one of Ireland's most powerful nobles, became an early and crucial supporter. His endorsement lent credibility to Simnel's claims and opened doors throughout Irish aristocratic society. Other nobles followed suit, each bringing their own retainers, resources, and political connections to what was rapidly becoming a serious threat to Tudor authority. But the Irish supporters wanted more than just recognition of their new champion. They demanded concrete action that would demonstrate both Simnel's legitimacy and their own commitment to his cause. The solution they proposed was as bold as it was unprecedented. They would crown Lambert Simnel as King of England in Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral, creating a rival royal court that could challenge Henry VII's authority directly. The coronation ceremony that took place in Christ Church Cathedral on May 24, 1487, was unlike anything Ireland had ever witnessed. Here was a 10-year-old boy, the son of an organ maker from Oxford, being crowned with ancient rituals and genuine reverence as Edward VI, King of England and Lord of Ireland. The irony was lost on no one present. Yet the ceremony proceeded with all the solemnity and grandeur that Irish resources could muster. The crown placed on Simnel's head was borrowed from a statue of the Virgin Mary, hastily requisitioned for the occasion when no proper royal crown could be located. Yet, in the eyes of the assembled Irish nobility, this makeshift coronation carried the full weight of legitimate royal succession. They knelt before their boy king with genuine devotion, swearing oaths of fealty that they fully intended to honor with their lives and fortunes. The newly crowned Edward VI established his court in Dublin Castle, where he held audiences, received ambassadors, and issued proclamations with all the authority of a legitimate monarch. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The organ-maker's son had become so thoroughly immersed in his royal persona that observers noted he carried himself with natural dignity and spoke with the measured authority expected of one born to rule. But crowning a pretender king was one thing. Actually, challenging the established Tudor monarchy would require far more than Irish enthusiasm and borrowed regalia. What Simnel's supporters needed was foreign backing, preferably from a power strong enough to provide the military resources necessary for a successful invasion of England. Their prayers were answered when word reached the continent of this New Yorkist claimant to the English throne. Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of the late Yorkist kings Edward IV and Richard III, had never accepted the Tudor victory at Bosworth Field. From her court in the Low Countries, she had been quietly supporting various plots against Henry VII, waiting for the right opportunity to strike back at the dynasty she viewed as illegitimate usurpers. The appearance of someone claiming to be her nephew Edward of Warwick seemed like divine providence. Margaret's support transformed Simnel's cause from a regional Irish rebellion into a serious international threat to Tudor rule. She provided not just financial backing, but something far more valuable: military expertise in the form of experienced Flemish and German mercenaries led by Martin Schwartz, a seasoned commander who had fought in numerous European conflicts. These professional soldiers would form the backbone of any invasion force, providing the military competence that Irish enthusiasm alone could not supply. The preparations for invasion revealed the remarkable extent to which various European powers were willing to support challenges to Henry VII's authority. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, while not providing direct military support, made it clear that he would not interfere with Margaret's efforts. Various German princes contributed funds or allowed recruitment within their territories. The complex web of European politics, where England's enemies saw opportunity in supporting any credible pretender, worked entirely in Simnel's favor. Meanwhile, Henry VII was facing his own challenges in responding to this threat. The pretender's supporters had chosen their timing well, launching their challenge when the Tudor king was still consolidating his relatively new dynasty. Henry had won his crown through military conquest rather than clear hereditary right, making him vulnerable to challenges that questioned his legitimacy. Moreover, many English nobles remained lukewarm in their support for the Tudor regime, creating uncertainty about how they might react when faced with a direct military challenge. The king's intelligence network, however, was better than his enemies realized. Through careful surveillance and strategic bribes, Henry's agents had identified the real Edward of Warwick still imprisoned in the Tower of London, and had gathered detailed information about the pretender's true identity. But simply possessing this knowledge was not enough. Henry needed to discredit the pretender in a way that would convince not just his own subjects, but the international community that was watching these events unfold. Henry's response was characteristically cunning. Rather than simply announcing that he held the real Edward of Warwick in the Tower, he arranged for the genuine Earl to be publicly displayed in London, parading him through the streets where he could be seen and recognized by nobles who had known him before his imprisonment. This public appearance effectively undermined Simnel's claims among those who were paying attention, but many of the pretender's supporters either dismissed this display as featuring an imposter or simply ignored information that contradicted their preferred narrative. The invasion force that assembled in Ireland during the spring of 1487 represented a fascinating coalition of interests and motivations. Irish nobles, seeking independence from English rule, fought alongside Flemish mercenaries, motivated by professional duty and financial reward. Yorkist loyalists who genuinely believed in Simnel's identity served beside political opportunists who simply saw a chance to advance their own fortunes. German soldiers seeking adventure and plunder marched with English exiles who dreamed of returning to their homeland in triumph. Lambert Simnel himself, now thoroughly inhabiting his royal persona, moved among these diverse supporters with remarkable poise. Contemporary accounts describe a boy who seemed genuinely to believe in his own royal identity, speaking with natural authority about his plans to reclaim his throne and reward those who had supported his cause. Whether this confidence reflected genuine delusion or simply masterful acting remains one of the fascinating mysteries surrounding this extraordinary deception. The military preparations revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the pretender's position. The corps of professional mercenaries provided excellent training and discipline, while Irish enthusiasm supplied numbers and local knowledge. However, the force lacked the heavy cavalry and artillery that would be essential for success against Henry's well-equipped royal army. Moreover, the coalition's diverse motivations created potential weaknesses that a skilled opponent might exploit. As spring turned to summer, the invasion force made final preparations for their assault on England. Ships were assembled to transport the army across the Irish Sea. Weapons were distributed and maintained, and intelligence networks attempted to gauge the likely response of English nobles to their arrival. The pretender king held council meetings where strategy was debated and refined, always maintaining the fiction that these were the deliberations of a legitimate monarch planning to reclaim his rightful inheritance. The psychological warfare that preceded the actual invasion was almost as important as the military preparations. Proclamations were issued in the name of Edward VI, calling upon loyal subjects to rise against the usurper Henry Tudor and welcome their rightful king. These documents, carefully crafted to appeal to various grievances against the current regime, were smuggled into England and distributed through networks of sympathizers and discontented nobles. The response to these proclamations would provide crucial intelligence about the level of support the pretender might expect once he landed in England. Early reports were encouraging, with various nobles expressing private sympathy for the Yorkist cause and criticism of Henry VII's policies. However, expressions of sympathy were very different from commitments to active support, and many nobles remained carefully neutral, waiting to see how events would unfold before committing themselves to either side. The landing site chosen for the invasion reflected careful strategic thinking about where the pretender's forces might find the most favorable reception. Rather than attempting to land near London, where Henry's forces would be concentrated, the invasion planners selected the northwest coast of England in Lancashire, where Yorkist sympathies remained strong, and the local population might be expected to welcome their arrival. The decision to land at Peel Island, a small outcropping off the coast of Lancashire, seemed almost anticlimactic given the grand ambitions of the enterprise. Yet this humble beginning would soon escalate into one of the most significant military challenges faced by the early Tudor dynasty. The boy, who had started life as the son of an organ maker, was about to lead an army of invasion against the King of England, supported by foreign mercenaries and Irish nobles who believed completely in his fabricated royal identity. The actual landing proceeded without significant opposition, as Henry's coastal defenses had not anticipated an invasion at this remote location. The sight of professional soldiers disembarking alongside their pretender king must have been both thrilling and terrifying for the local population, who suddenly found themselves at the center of a dynastic struggle that would determine the future of the English crown. As news of the landing spread throughout northern England, The critical question became whether Lambert Simnel's supporters had correctly gauged the mood of the English people. Would the appearance of a Yorkist claimant spark the popular uprising they had hoped for? Or would it reveal that Henry VII's hold on power was stronger than his enemies had believed? The answer would determine not just the fate of this remarkable pretender, but the stability of the entire Tudor dynasty. The stage was now set for one of the most unusual military campaigns in English history, where a 10-year-old impostor would lead foreign mercenaries and Irish nobles in battle against the established monarch of England. What followed would demonstrate both the incredible audacity of medieval royal pretenders and the harsh realities that awaited those whose ambitions exceeded their capabilities. Ambitions exceeded their capabilities. The march inland from Peel Island revealed the complex realities facing any medieval pretender who dared to challenge an established monarch. Lambert Simnel's force, numbering perhaps 4,000 men, moved through the Lancashire countryside with the disciplined precision of Martin Schwartz's German mercenaries at its core. But the response from local populations was far more muted than his supporters had anticipated. Villages watched the passing army with wary curiosity rather than enthusiasm, and the expected flood of English volunteers joining their rightful king simply failed to materialize. The pretender himself rode at the head of his column with all the bearing of legitimate royalty, his posture erect, his manner composed despite being barely 10 years old. Contemporary chroniclers who witnessed his passage noted the remarkable transformation that had been wrought in this common-born child. He spoke to his commanders with natural authority, received reports from scouts with princely dignity, and maintained the fiction of his royal identity so completely that even skeptical observers found themselves momentarily convinced by his performance. Yet beneath the surface confidence, cracks were already beginning to show in the coalition that had brought him this far. The Irish nobles, brave as they were, found themselves increasingly out of their element in English territory. The German mercenaries, professional soldiers all, began to question the wisdom of their employment as they realized the limited popular support for their cause. The English exiles who had joined the expedition whispered among themselves about the dangers they faced if captured, knowing that Henry VII would show little mercy to those who had taken arms against him. The intelligence reaching both armies as they maneuvered across the northern English landscape painted an increasingly clear picture of the military situation. Henry VII had not been caught unprepared by this challenge to his authority. The Tudor king had assembled a formidable royal army, drawing upon the resources of a kingdom that had enjoyed several years of relative peace and prosperity under his rule. More importantly, Henry had secured the support of key noble families whose loyalty might otherwise have been in question, binding them to his cause through a combination of rewards, threats, and carefully managed political obligations. The Earl of Oxford, one of England's most experienced military commanders, had been given overall command of the royal forces. His reputation for tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty to the Tudor cause provided Henry with exactly the kind of professional leadership needed to counter the threat posed by foreign mercenaries. Under Oxford's guidance, the royal army moved with purpose and coordination, positioning itself to intercept the pretenders' forces before they could advance toward more strategically valuable targets. As the two armies drew closer to their inevitable confrontation, the psychological warfare that had preceded the invasion intensified dramatically. Henry VII made a masterful propaganda move by publicly displaying the real Edward of Warwick once again, this time before a carefully selected audience of nobles and church officials who could testify to his identity. The message was clear and devastating to Simnel's cause. The supposed Earl of Warwick was safely in royal custody, making the pretender's claims transparently false. Yet the pretender's supporters had invested too much in their cause to abandon it now based on Tudor propaganda. Margaret of Burgundy's representatives dismissed Henry's display as an elaborate deception, claiming that the boy shown in London was himself an impostor while the true Edward marched with their army. The Irish nobles, having already crowned their king in Dublin, found it impossible to admit they had been deceived without facing complete political ruin. The German mercenaries, bound by contracts and professional honor, prepared to fight regardless of their private doubts about their employer's legitimacy. The campaign revealed the sophisticated intelligence networks that both sides had developed to monitor each other's movements and intentions. Henry's agents, many of them positioned within noble households that remained officially neutral, provided regular updates on the pretender's strength, morale, and strategic planning. In return, Simnel's supporters had cultivated their own sources of information about royal army positions, supply lines, and the reliability of various noble commitments to the Tudor cause. These intelligence operations sometimes took on almost theatrical qualities, with spies posing as merchants, pilgrims, or traveling entertainers to gather information about enemy activities. Messages were concealed in innocent-looking documents, encoded in apparently routine business correspondence, or transmitted through networks of sympathizers who might never meet face-to-face. The medieval art of espionage, while lacking modern technological advantages, demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its methods and organization. The Pretender's Council of War, held in a commandeered manor house, as the army advanced deeper into enemy territory, illustrated the complex dynamics that governed such coalitions of convenience. Irish nobles argued for aggressive action that would demonstrate their commitment to the cause while potentially triggering the popular uprising they still hoped might occur. German mercenary captains favored defensive positions that would maximize their professional advantages while minimizing casualties among their expensive troops. English exiles pushed for rapid advances toward London, believing that bold action might yet win them the victory that would restore their fortunes. Lambert Simnel himself, presiding over these debates with remarkable composure for someone so young, had to balance these competing interests while maintaining the royal authority that justified his entire enterprise. His comments during these councils, as recorded by surviving participants, reveal a fascinating blend of genuine strategic insight and carefully rehearsed royal rhetoric. Whether he truly understood the military situation he faced, or was simply repeating lessons learned from his handlers, the Pretender demonstrated an ability to inspire confidence among his followers, even as their situation grew increasingly desperate. The logistical challenges facing both armies as they maneuvered through the English countryside were enormous. Medieval military campaigns required careful coordination of supply lines, secure communications with base territories, and constant attention to troop morale and discipline. The Pretender's forces faced particular difficulties as foreign troops operating in hostile territory, dependent on uncertain local support for food, shelter, and intelligence about enemy movements. Henry's royal army, while better supplied and operating from friendly territory, faced its own challenges in maintaining the coalition of noble interests that supported the Tudor regime. Some nobles had provided troops reluctantly, calculating that supporting the king was safer than risking accusations of disloyalty, but their commitment might waver if the campaign proved costly or unsuccessful. Others had brought impressive forces, but harbored private doubts about Tudor legitimacy that could surface if the Pretender demonstrated unexpected strength or popular support. The religious dimensions of this conflict added another layer of complexity to an already intricate political situation. Both sides claimed divine sanction for their cause, with priests and bishops offering prayers for victory, while carefully avoiding commitments that might prove embarrassing if fortune favored the other army. The Pretender's supporters emphasized the injustice of imprisoning the rightful heir, and the divine obligation to restore legitimate royal authority. Henry's supporters countered with arguments about the sacred nature of anointed kingship, and the sin of rebellion against God's appointed ruler. These theological debates were not merely abstract exercises, but had practical implications for the loyalty of troops and the support of civilian populations. Medieval soldiers took religious obligations seriously, and many would hesitate to fight against someone they believed to be their rightful king, regardless of their personal feelings about the current regime. Similarly, local populations might provide assistance or refuse cooperation based on their understanding of which side enjoyed divine favor. The march toward confrontation revealed the remarkable personal courage of Lambert Simnel, whatever his true identity might have been. A boy barely into his second decade of life was leading an army of hardened professional soldiers against the established monarch of England, maintaining his composure and royal bearing, despite facing almost certain death if captured. His handlers had clearly prepared him well for this role, but no amount of training could fully prepare someone so young for the psychological pressures of command in such desperate circumstances. Contemporary accounts describe moments when the pretender's youth showed through his royal facade, particularly during the long hours of waiting that preceded military action. He would sometimes be observed staring toward the horizon with an expression of profound thoughtfulness, as if contemplating the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him to this point. Yet, when called upon to address his troops or meet with commanders, he would immediately resume his princely demeanor, speaking with authority that seemed to convince even skeptical professional soldiers. The German mercenaries who formed the backbone of his military force developed what can only be described as protective affection for their young employer. These were men who had fought in numerous European conflicts, serving various causes for adequate pay and professional satisfaction, but they had never before been asked to follow a child king into battle against such overwhelming odds. Their letters home, several of which survived in German archives, reveal a fascinating mixture of professional pride, personal sympathy, and growing awareness that they were participating in what would likely be their final campaign. Martin Schwartz, the expedition's military commander, found himself in the unusual position of trying to provide realistic strategic advice to a 10-year-old who officially outranked him, and whose supporters insisted on treating as divinely appointed royalty. His tactical planning had to account not only for the military realities of facing a larger, better-equipped royal army, but also for the political necessities of maintaining the fiction that supported the entire enterprise. Every decision had to be presented as serving the strategic interests of the rightful King Edward VI, even when military logic suggested courses of action that might compromise the pretender's safety or dignity. The intelligence reports reaching both armies as they approached their final confrontation painted an increasingly clear picture of the odds facing Simnel's forces. Henry's royal army had grown steadily as more nobles brought their retainers to serve the Tudor cause, while the pretender's coalition had gained few additional supporters since landing in England. More ominously, several key figures who might have been expected to support a Yorkist claimant had either declared for Henry VII or maintained careful neutrality that effectively favored the established regime. The psychological pressure on both sides intensified as the decisive battle approached. Henry VII, despite his apparent advantages, remained acutely aware that military defeat would likely mean not just personal death, but the end of the Tudor dynasty before it had truly established itself. His supporters, many of whom had benefited from his patronage but retained memories of previous regime changes, understood that backing the losing side in this confrontation could mean forfeiture of lands, titles, and possibly lives. For the pretender's supporters, the stakes were even higher. The Irish nobles had committed their honor and resources to a cause that now appeared increasingly desperate. The German mercenaries faced the professional soldier's nightmare of fighting a losing battle for employers who might not survive to pay their wages. The English exiles who had joined the expedition knew that capture would almost certainly mean execution for treason, with no hope of royal mercy for those who had taken foreign gold to fight against their native king. Yet, despite these mounting pressures, both armies maintained their discipline and cohesion as they maneuvered toward what everyone understood would be a decisive confrontation. The pretender continued to hold councils of war, issue proclamations in his assumed royal name, and maintain the elaborate fiction that had brought him so far. His supporters, whatever their private doubts, remained committed to seeing their enterprise through to its conclusion, whether that meant glorious victory or honorable defeat. The final positioning of forces revealed the tactical acumen of both commanders as they sought advantages that might compensate for their respective weaknesses. The Royal Army, larger and better equipped, aimed to bring maximum force to bear in a direct confrontation that would quickly resolve the campaign. The Pretenders' forces, outnumbered but including experienced professional soldiers, sought terrain and circumstances that might allow superior training and discipline to overcome numerical disadvantage. As dawn broke on what would become known as the Battle of Stoke Field, the remarkable story of Lambert Simnel approached its climax. The boy, who had been crowned King of Ireland and had led foreign mercenaries in invasion of England, was about to discover whether audacity, preparation, and the support of powerful allies could overcome the fundamental reality that he was challenging one of Europe's most successful monarchs on his home territory, with limited popular support and increasingly desperate military odds. The Battle of Stoke Field began in the early morning mist of June 16, 1487, with all the pageantry and terror that marked medieval warfare at its most decisive. Lambert Simnel, mounted on a destrier that had been carefully selected to enhance his royal appearance, rode among his troops offering words of encouragement that seemed to flow naturally from his young lips. The transformation was complete now. Whatever humble origins had shaped his early years completely subsumed beneath the persona of Edward VI, rightful King of England, leading his loyal subjects against usurpers who had stolen his birthright. The battlefield itself stretched across rolling meadows near the village of East Stoke, terrain that offered both armies opportunities to deploy their forces according to their strategic preferences. Henry VII's Royal Army, numbering perhaps 12,000 men, arranged itself in the traditional three battles formation that had served English armies well in previous conflicts. The vanguard, commanded by the Earl of Oxford, consisted primarily of professional soldiers and loyal retainers whose commitment to the Tudor cause had been tested and proven. Behind them, Henry himself commanded the main battle, surrounded by the banners and household troops of nobles, whose support provided both military strength and political legitimacy. The Pretenders' forces, outnumbered by nearly 3-1, deployed with the desperate precision of men who understood that tactical excellence might be their only path to survival. Martin Schwartz positioned his German mercenaries at the center of the line, their disciplined ranks and superior equipment forming the backbone around which Irish enthusiasm and English exile determination could be organized. The sight of these foreign professionals, their armor gleaming despite the morning mist, their weapons held with casual competence born of countless previous battles, provided reassurance to allies who had staked everything on this single confrontation. Lambert Simnel took his position according to medieval convention, surrounded by his most trusted commanders and protected by a guard of picked men whose loyalty had been secured through months of shared hardship and careful cultivation. Yet, even in this moment of supreme danger, contemporary accounts emphasize how naturally he seemed to inhabit his royal role. His bearing remained erect, his voice steady as he gave final instructions to messengers, his demeanor that of someone born to command rather than a commoner's son playing an elaborate part. The opening phases of the battle followed predictable patterns, as both armies tested each other's resolve and positioning through skirmishing and archery exchanges. Henry's forces, better supplied and more numerous, could afford to probe for weaknesses while maintaining defensive formations that minimized their casualties. The Pretenders' army, aware that time favored their enemies, sought opportunities for decisive action that might break royal morale before superior numbers could tell. The Irish contingent, fighting with the fierce determination of men defending their newly crowned king, launched several brave but costly charges against the royal lines. Their courage was undeniable, but their equipment and training proved inadequate against the professional soldiers who formed the core of Henry's army. Casualties mounted rapidly among these enthusiastic amateurs, yet they continued fighting with a devotion that impressed even their enemies. The German mercenaries, meanwhile, demonstrated the tactical sophistication that had made them valuable commodities in European warfare. Under Schwarz's experienced leadership, they maintained disciplined formations while seeking opportunities to exploit gaps in the Royal Army's deployment. Their professionalism provided a stark contrast to the wild Irish charges, yet both groups shared an absolute commitment to the cause that had brought them to this desperate battlefield. As the battle intensified, the pretender found himself facing the ultimate test of his elaborate deception. Real combat, unlike the carefully staged ceremonies and audiences that had marked his previous royal performances, could not be managed through preparation and acting skill alone. Yet contemporary sources suggest that Lambert Simnel rose to this challenge with remarkable composure, remaining visible to his troops and continuing to issue orders with apparent calm, even as the military situation deteriorated around him. The turning point came when Henry VII's superior numbers began to tell against the pretender's flanks. Despite the heroic efforts of individual units and the tactical skill of their commanders, Simnel's forces found themselves increasingly surrounded and pressed from multiple directions. The Royal Army, sensing victory within reach, pressed their attacks with renewed vigor while maintaining the disciplined coordination that had characterized their entire campaign. Martin Schwarz, the professional soldier who had staked his reputation on this desperate venture, fell fighting in the front ranks of his mercenaries, his death marking the effective end of organized resistance to the royal forces. The German professionals, leaderless but still disciplined, began a fighting withdrawal that quickly degenerated into general retreat as Irish courage finally broke under impossible pressure. The pretender himself, despite the urging of his remaining supporters to flee while escape might still be possible, reportedly remained on the battlefield until the very end of organized resistance. Whether this reflected genuine courage, resignation to his fate, or simply the completeness with which he had absorbed his royal persona, his behavior in these final moments impressed even enemies who had every reason to view him as nothing more than an ambitious fraud. When capture finally came, it arrived not through dramatic single combat or heroic last stands, but through the prosaic reality of being overwhelmed by superior numbers and having no remaining avenue of escape. The boy, who had been crowned King of Ireland and had led foreign armies in invasion of England, found himself a prisoner of the very man he had sought to depose. His elaborate deception finally confronted by the harsh mathematics of medieval warfare. The aftermath of Stokefield revealed both Henry VII's political acumen and the complex realities that governed royal imposture in this turbulent period. Rather than executing the captured pretender, as might have been expected given the serious threat he had posed to Tudor authority, Henry chose a response that was both merciful and psychologically devastating to his enemy's cause. Lambert Simnel would live, but not as the tragic martyr that execution might have made him. Instead, the king demonstrated his complete victory by publicly revealing the pretender's true identity and humble origins before assigning him to work in the royal kitchens as a turnspit, later promoting him to the position of falconer. This treatment served multiple purposes simultaneously. It showed Henry's magnanimity toward a child who had been manipulated by ambitious adults, undermined any remaining belief in Simnel's royal identity, and provided a daily reminder to potential conspirators of how royal pretensions could end. The psychological impact of this resolution cannot be overstated. Here was living proof that the supposed Earl of Warwick had been nothing more than an organ-maker's son, his royal bearing and educated speech the products of careful training rather than noble birth. The fiction that had convinced Irish nobles to crown him king and German mercenaries to fight for him was exposed as exactly that, a fiction maintained through skillful acting and the willingness of supporters to believe what they desperately wanted to be true. Yet, even in defeat and exposure, Lambert Simnel's story retained elements that troubled those who had opposed him. The completeness of his transformation from common child to convincing royal pretender raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of legitimacy itself. If a commoner's son could be trained to embody royal authority so convincingly that experienced nobles accepted his claims, what did that say about the supposedly inherent qualities that justified royal rule? The broader implications of the Simnel conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate military and political consequences of its failure. European courts took careful note of how close this elaborate deception had come to succeeding, and how effectively foreign support could be mobilized behind credible pretenders to established thrones. The precedent was troubling for legitimate monarchs throughout the continent, suggesting that their own positions might be more vulnerable to similar challenges than they had previously assumed. Margaret of Burgundy, despite the failure of her protégé's cause, emerged from the affair with her reputation for supporting Yorkist claimants enhanced rather than damaged. Her willingness to provide substantial military and financial support for challenges to Tudor authority served notice that Henry VII's enemies retained both resources and determination to continue their opposition. This reality would shape English foreign policy for years to come, as the Tudor regime worked to neutralize external support for potential future pretenders. The Irish nobles who had supported Simnel faced varying consequences for their participation in the conspiracy. Some, particularly those who had played leading roles in the pretender's coronation, found themselves stripped of titles and lands. Their political careers effectively ended by their association with the failed cause. Others, judged to have been deceived rather than deliberately treasonous, received pardons that allowed them to retain their positions while serving as examples of royal mercy. The fate of the surviving German mercenaries illustrated the complex legal and practical issues that arose when professional soldiers served causes that were later deemed illegitimate. Many were executed as traitors, despite arguments that they had simply fulfilled military contracts with employers they had believed to be legitimate. Others were ransomed back to their home territories or allowed to enter English service under carefully supervised conditions. The English exiles who had joined Simnel's cause faced the harshest treatment, as Henry VII viewed their participation as the most serious form of treason. Having fled England to avoid Tudor rule, then returning with foreign armies to overthrow their native king, they had placed themselves beyond hope of royal mercy. Most who survived the battle were executed, their heads displayed as warnings to others who might consider similar enterprises. The intelligence networks that had supported both sides during the campaign underwent careful analysis, as each regime sought to understand how information had flowed and where security had been compromised. The sophistication of these medieval spy systems, revealed through interrogations and captured documents, demonstrated that the art of espionage had reached remarkable levels of development, even in an age before modern communication technologies. Religious authorities found themselves in particularly delicate positions following the conspiracy's exposure. Priests and bishops who had supported Simnel's claims faced questions about their judgment and loyalty, while those who had remained neutral had to justify their failure to denounce what was now clearly revealed as fraud. The intersection of religious authority and political legitimacy, always complex in medieval society, became even more fraught in the aftermath of such elaborate deceptions. The propaganda value of Simnel's exposure extended far beyond England's borders, as Henry VII's agents worked to spread news of the pretender's true identity and humble fate throughout European courts. The message was clear and pointed. Support for challengers to Tudor authority would not only fail militarily, but would result in the public humiliation of those who had been deceived by false claimants. Yet, even as one royal impostor was thoroughly exposed and defeated, The conditions that had made it possible remained largely unchanged. Communication still traveled at the speed of horseback. Identity verification remained primitive, and political instability continued to create opportunities for ambitious pretenders. The success of Lambert Simnel's deception, even though it ultimately failed, provided a template that other imposters would study and attempt to improve upon. The broader European political situation that had enabled foreign support for the Simnel conspiracy persisted long after the pretender himself had been relegated to obscurity in Henry's household. The complex web of dynastic claims, territorial disputes, and religious conflicts that characterized late medieval politics continued to create opportunities for ambitious individuals to exploit uncertainty about legitimate succession. The psychological aspects of royal imposture, so clearly demonstrated in Lambert Simnel's case, became subjects of fascinated analysis among contemporary observers. How could a common child be transformed so completely into a convincing member of the royal House of York? What did this transformation reveal about the nature of nobility itself, and the extent to which aristocratic bearing might be learned rather than inherited? These questions would prove prophetic, as the late medieval and early modern periods would witness numerous other cases of royal imposture, each building upon lessons learned from previous attempts while adapting to changing political and technological circumstances. The age of pretenders was far from over, and Lambert Simnel's brief reign as a crowned king of Ireland would inspire others to attempt even more audacious deceptions in their quest for royal authority they had never legitimately possessed. The legacy of Lambert Simnel's extraordinary deception reverberated through the courts and corridors of power across Europe, but it was far from the end of the story. In fact, his brief but spectacular career as a royal pretender had inadvertently opened a door that would prove impossible to close. Within a few years of Simnel's relegation to the royal kitchens, another figure would emerge from the shadows of European politics, armed with an even more compelling claim and a far more sophisticated understanding of the art of royal deception. This new pretender would learn from Simnel's mistakes while capitalizing on the very success of his predecessor's initial performance. If an organ maker's son could convince Irish nobles and German mercenaries of his royal identity, what might be accomplished by someone with better preparation, more convincing documentation, and the backing of even more powerful foreign sponsors? The answer would come in the form of a young man who called himself Richard, Duke of York, and whose claims would prove far more difficult to dismiss than those of his predecessor. The political landscape that gave birth to this new pretender was shaped by the very success of Henry VII's victory at Stoke Field. The Tudor king's decisive defeat of the Simnel conspiracy had demonstrated his military competence and political acumen, but it had also revealed the extent of opposition to his rule that simmered beneath the surface of apparent stability. Foreign enemies had been shown to possess both the resources and the determination to support serious challenges to Tudor authority, while domestic discontent remained a constant threat to dynastic security. Margaret of Burgundy, far from being discouraged by the failure of her first protégé, began almost immediately to search for another candidate who might serve her anti-Tudor objectives more effectively. Her court in the Low Countries became a magnet for English exiles, disaffected nobles, and ambitious adventurers who shared her commitment to overthrowing the dynasty she viewed as illegitimate usurpers. The lessons learned from the Simnel affair informed every aspect of her planning for future operations. The new pretender who emerged from this environment was a figure of considerably greater mystery and sophistication than his predecessor. Where Lambert Simnel had been clearly identified as the son of an organ maker from Oxford, this new claimant's origins remained frustratingly obscure to both contemporary investigators and modern historians. He appeared in Margaret's court sometime around 1490, bearing documentation that seemed to support his claim to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had vanished in the Tower of London during the reign of Richard III. The choice of this particular identity was strategically brilliant in ways that revealed careful study of the Simnel precedent. Unlike the Earl of Warwick, whose continued imprisonment in the Tower could be verified by public display, the fate of the princes in the Tower remained genuinely uncertain. Their disappearance had been one of the great mysteries of the late 15th century, with various theories about their survival or murder competing for acceptance among political observers. A pretender claiming to be one of these vanished princes could not be easily disproven by producing the genuine article. Moreover, Richard of York represented a more direct and compelling claim to the English throne than the Earl of Warwick had offered. As the second son of Edward IV, he possessed an unquestionably legitimate bloodline that many would argue gave him stronger hereditary rights than Henry VII could claim. His supposed survival and return would appeal not only to die-hard Yorkist loyalists, but potentially to anyone who had doubts about the Tudor dynasty's legitimacy or who harbored grievances against Henry's policies. The preparation and training that transformed this mysterious young man into a convincing Duke of York far exceeded anything that had been attempted with Lambert Simnel. Margaret of Burgundy, drawing upon resources accumulated over years of opposing Tudor rule, assembled a team of experts who could provide comprehensive education in every aspect of royal identity that the pretender would need to master. Former courtiers who had known the real princes personally coached him in family details and court protocols. Skilled linguists ensured his mastery of the multiple languages expected of European royalty. Professional diplomats taught him the intricate relationships between ruling houses that would be essential for convincing foreign observers of his authenticity. The physical transformation was equally comprehensive. The pretender's appearance, bearing, and mannerisms were carefully refined to match contemporary descriptions of royal deportment. His clothing, while not yet of truly royal quality, was upgraded to reflect the highest levels of aristocratic fashion. Even his signature was practiced until it matched surviving examples of royal correspondence with convincing accuracy. Every detail that might betray humble origins was methodically identified and corrected. The documentation supporting his claims was far more sophisticated than anything that had accompanied Lambert Simnel's deception. Letters of recognition from various European nobles, genealogical charts tracing his lineage, and detailed accounts of his supposed escape from the Tower and subsequent adventures created an impressive paper trail that would take considerable effort to disprove. Some of these documents were outright forgeries, but others were genuine letters from nobles who had been convinced of his authenticity through careful presentation and manipulation. The international support that coalesced around this new pretender demonstrated how effectively the lessons of the Simnel affair had been absorbed and applied. Rather than relying primarily on Irish enthusiasm and German mercenaries, the conspiracy attracted backing from multiple European powers who saw opportunity in supporting a credible challenger to Henry VII. The French court, perpetually at odds with England, provided financial assistance and diplomatic recognition. Various Italian princes offered sanctuaries and resources. Most significantly, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian extended formal acknowledgement of the pretender's claims, lending imperial prestige to what might otherwise have been dismissed as another adventurer's scheme. The pretender himself, now calling himself Richard IV, established a rival court that operated with remarkable sophistication from various European locations. Unlike Lambert Simnel, who had been essentially a puppet manipulated by adult handlers, this new claimant demonstrated genuine political acumen and leadership ability that impressed even skeptical observers. His correspondence with potential supporters revealed strategic thinking and diplomatic skill that suggested either exceptional natural talent or extraordinarily comprehensive preparation for his role. The intelligence network supporting both the pretender and his Tudor opponents reached new levels of sophistication as each side sought advantages in what was becoming a complex game of international intrigue. Spies, double agents, and informants operated throughout European courts, gathering information about military preparations, political negotiations, and the shifting loyalties of potential supporters. The cost of maintaining these networks was enormous, but the stakes justified almost any expense. Henry VII's response to this new challenge revealed how much he had learned from his experience with the Simnel conspiracy. Rather than simply preparing military countermeasures, the Tudor king launched a comprehensive diplomatic offensive designed to isolate the pretender from his foreign supporters. English gold flowed to European courts where it might purchase neutrality or active opposition to the challenger. Trade agreements and marriage negotiations were structured to reward cooperation with Tudor interests while punishing support for the pretender. The propaganda war that accompanied these diplomatic maneuvers was equally sophisticated. Henry's agents worked systematically to spread doubt about the pretender's identity, circulating alternative theories about his origins and highlighting inconsistencies in his documented claims. Simultaneously, they promoted positive narratives about Tudor achievements and legitimacy, emphasizing the peace and prosperity that England had enjoyed under Henry's rule, compared to the chaos that had characterized previous dynastic disputes. The pretender's supporters countered with their own propaganda campaigns that highlighted Henry's questionable claim to the throne and the circumstances of his victory at Bosworth Field. They emphasized the rightful inheritance of the House of York and the injustice of imprisoning legitimate heirs while usurpers occupied their rightful positions. These competing narratives created a complex information environment where truth became increasingly difficult to distinguish from carefully crafted deception. The military preparations that accompanied these political maneuvers reflected the escalating seriousness of the threat posed by this new pretender. Unlike the relatively modest force that had supported Lambert Simnel, the coalition backing Richard IV assembled resources that could potentially challenge Tudor authority more effectively than any previous conspiracy. Professional soldiers from multiple European armies were recruited and trained for potential invasion operations. Naval assets were assembled to transport and supply expeditionary forces. Artillery and other advanced military technologies were acquired to provide advantages that the Simnel expedition had lacked. The economic implications of these military preparations were staggering for all parties involved. Margaret of Burgundy committed enormous portions of her resources to supporting the pretender's cause, mortgaging properties and borrowing against future revenues to fund the conspiracy. Foreign supporters contributed according to their means and their assessment of potential benefits from a successful Tudor overthrow. Even Henry VII found himself compelled to spend heavily on military preparations and diplomatic initiatives designed to counter the growing threat. The social impact of this prolonged confrontation extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect ordinary people throughout England and continental Europe. Trade relationships were disrupted as political loyalties influenced commercial decisions. Families found themselves divided as different members chose to support opposing sides in the dynastic dispute. Religious communities struggled to maintain neutrality while facing pressure to endorse one claimant or the other based on theological arguments about legitimate authority. The technological innovations that emerged from this extended period of preparation and conflict had lasting implications for European warfare and statecraft. Improved communication systems allowed for more rapid transmission of intelligence across international boundaries. Enhanced document authentication techniques were developed to combat the increasingly sophisticated forgeries being produced by both sides. Military engineering advanced as armies prepared for confrontations that might determine the fate of kingdoms. The cultural impact of royal imposture, as exemplified by both Lambert Simnel and his more successful successor, influenced literature, art, and popular imagination throughout Europe. Stories of pretenders who might or might not be legitimate heirs captured public fascination in ways that reflected deeper anxieties about identity, legitimacy, and social order. These narratives would continue to resonate long after the immediate political threats had been resolved. The psychological dimensions of extended deception, as demonstrated by pretenders who maintained false identities for years rather than months, revealed new insights into human adaptability and the nature of identity itself. Contemporary observers noted how thoroughly these individuals seemed to inhabit their assumed roles, raising questions about whether prolonged performance might eventually become indistinguishable from reality in the performer's own mind. The diplomatic precedents established during this period of intensified royal imposture had lasting implications for international relations throughout early modern Europe. The recognition extended by legitimate monarchs to questionable claimants created legal and political complications that would influence succession disputes for generations. The use of pretenders as diplomatic weapons demonstrated how dynastic legitimacy could be weaponized in international conflicts. The intelligence techniques developed during these extended conspiracies laid groundwork for the more systematic espionage networks that would characterize early modern statecraft. The methods used to gather information, verify identities, and coordinate activities across international boundaries provided templates that would be refined and expanded by subsequent generations of spies and diplomats. As this new and more sophisticated pretender prepared to test his claims against Tudor authority, the stage was set for confrontations that would prove even more complex and consequential than the straightforward military campaign that had ended Lambert Simnel's brief reign. The lessons learned from that earlier conspiracy had been absorbed by both sides, creating conditions for a prolonged struggle that would test not only military capabilities but political acumen, diplomatic skill, and the very foundations of royal legitimacy in an age where identity remained fluid and truth could be as malleable as ambition demanded. The figure who would become known to history as Perkin Warbeck represented everything that Lambert Simnel's conspiracy had promised but failed to deliver. Where Simnel had been rushed into his role with minimal preparation, this new pretender spent years perfecting his royal persona under the careful tutelage of experts who understood exactly what had gone wrong the first time. Where Simnel had relied primarily on Irish enthusiasm and German professionalism, Warbeck cultivated a truly international coalition that included some of the most powerful courts in Europe. The mystery surrounding Warbeck's true origins only added to his effectiveness as a royal pretender. Contemporary investigators, despite access to extensive intelligence networks and substantial financial resources, could never definitively establish who he really was or where he had come from. Some claimed he was the son of a Flemish boatman. Others suggested connections to various noble families who might have reasons to oppose Tudor rule. The uncertainty itself became a weapon in his arsenal, allowing supporters to project their own hopes and assumptions onto his carefully constructed identity. The training regimen that transformed this mysterious young man into a convincing Duke of York was far more comprehensive than anything attempted with previous pretenders. Margaret of Burgundy had learned from Simnel's exposure that surface-level coaching was insufficient for long-term deception. Her new protégé spent months studying not just the public aspects of royal identity, but the intimate family details that only genuine princes would know. He learned the private jokes shared between the royal brothers, the childhood incidents that had shaped their personalities, even the specific ways they had interacted with servants and courtiers during their brief lives at court. The physical resemblance that Warbeck bore to the House of York was either remarkably fortunate coincidence or evidence of careful selection from among potential candidates. Contemporary portraits and descriptions suggest that he possessed the fair complexion, light hair, and aristocratic features that observers expected from Edward IV's bloodline. More importantly, he had somehow acquired the unconscious mannerisms and bearing that mark those born to royal privilege, gestures and expressions so subtle they could not be easily taught, yet were immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with authentic nobility. The documentation supporting Warbeck's claims represented a quantum leap in sophistication over the crude forgeries that had accompanied earlier conspiracies. Letters of recognition from European monarchs, detailed genealogical charts, and sworn testimonies from supposed witnesses to his escape from the tower created an impressive archive that would require considerable effort and expertise to disprove. Some of these documents were undoubtedly authentic, written by nobles who had been genuinely convinced of his legitimacy through careful presentation of evidence and a skillful manipulation of their existing prejudices against Tudor rule. The international support that coalesced around Warbeck's cause demonstrated how effectively the lessons of previous failures had been absorbed by Henry VII's enemies. Rather than relying on a single patron like Margaret of Burgundy, the new conspiracy cultivated backing from multiple European powers who saw a strategic advantage in supporting a credible challenger to English stability. The French court provided not just financial assistance but diplomatic recognition that lent legitimacy to what might otherwise have been dismissed as another adventurer's scheme. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian went even further, extending formal acknowledgement of Warbeck's claims and allowing him to establish a rival court within imperial territories. This recognition carried enormous symbolic weight, suggesting that the most powerful secular authority in Europe viewed the pretender's claims as at least potentially legitimate. For nobles and commoners alike who had doubts about Henry VII's right to rule, imperial recognition provided compelling evidence that their instincts might be correct. The pretender's own political acumen exceeded anything demonstrated by Lambert Simnel or his handlers during their brief moment of prominence. Warbeck displayed genuine diplomatic skill in his correspondence with potential supporters, tailoring his appeals to address their specific concerns and interests rather than simply demanding support based on abstract claims of legitimacy. His letters revealed strategic thinking and political sophistication that impressed even skeptical observers, suggesting either exceptional natural talent or extraordinarily comprehensive preparation for his assumed role. The rival court that Warbeck established operated with remarkable sophistication as it moved between various European locations seeking optimal advantage and security. Unlike Simnel's essentially military expedition, this new conspiracy created the full apparatus of alternative government, complete with diplomatic protocols, administrative procedures, and ceremonial traditions that mimicked legitimate royal practices. Foreign ambassadors could conduct business with this shadow regime as if it were already an established monarchy preparing to reclaim its rightful territories. The intelligence network supporting both the pretender and his Tudor opponents reached unprecedented levels of complexity, as each side sought advantages in what had become an international game of espionage and counter-espionage. Spies operated throughout European courts, gathering information about military preparations, political negotiations, and the shifting loyalties of potential supporters. Double agents played multiple sides against each other while attempting to protect their own interests. The cost of maintaining these networks was enormous, but the stakes justified almost any expenditure. Henry VII's response to this new and more sophisticated challenge revealed how much the Tudor regime had learned from its experience with the Simnel conspiracy. Rather than simply preparing military countermeasures, the king launched a comprehensive diplomatic offensive designed to isolate the pretender from his foreign supporters. English gold flowed to European courts where it might purchase neutrality or active opposition to the challenger. Trade agreements and marriage negotiations were structured to reward cooperation with Tudor interests while punishing those who provided aid to the conspiracy. The propaganda war that accompanied these diplomatic maneuvers was equally sophisticated and far-reaching. Henry's agents worked systematically to spread doubt about the pretender's identity. circulating alternative theories about his origins and highlighting supposed inconsistencies in his documented claims. They promoted narratives about Tudor achievements and the peace and prosperity that England had enjoyed under Henry's rule, contrasting this stability with the chaos that had characterized previous dynastic disputes. The Pretender's supporters countered with their own sophisticated propaganda campaigns that highlighted Henry's questionable path to the throne and the violent circumstances of his victory at Bosworth Field. They emphasized the rightful inheritance of the House of York and the injustice of allowing usurpers to occupy positions that belonged to legitimate heirs. These competing narratives created a complex information environment where truth became increasingly difficult to distinguish from carefully crafted political messaging. The military preparations that accompanied these political maneuvers reflected the escalating seriousness of the threat posed by this new conspiracy. Unlike the relatively modest force that had supported Lambert Simnel, the coalition backing Warbeck assembled resources that could potentially mount a sustained challenge to Tudor authority. Professional soldiers from multiple European armies were recruited and trained specifically for potential invasion operations. Naval assets were assembled to transport and supply expeditionary forces across the challenging waters that separated the continent from English shores. The economic implications of these extended preparations were staggering for all parties involved. Margaret of Burgundy continued to commit enormous portions of her resources to anti-Tudor activities, but she was now joined by other wealthy sponsors who viewed the conspiracy as a worthwhile investment in future political influence. The Pretender himself had to balance the immediate costs of maintaining his alternative court against the need to preserve resources for eventual military action. Even Henry VII found himself compelled to spend heavily on defensive measures and diplomatic initiatives designed to counter the growing international threat. The social impact of this prolonged confrontation extended throughout England and continental Europe, affecting ordinary people who had no direct involvement in dynastic politics. Trade relationships were disrupted as political loyalties began to influence commercial decisions. Families found themselves divided when different members chose to support opposing sides in the dispute. Religious communities struggled to maintain neutrality while facing increasing pressure to endorse one claimant or another based on theological arguments about legitimate authority and divine appointment. The technological innovations that emerged from this extended period of preparation and conflict had lasting implications for European warfare and statecraft. Communication systems were improved to allow more rapid transmission of intelligence across international boundaries. Document authentication techniques were developed to combat the increasingly sophisticated forgeries being produced by both sides. Military engineering advanced as armies prepared for confrontations that might determine the fate of kingdoms and reshape the balance of power throughout Europe. The cultural impact of this extended royal imposture influenced literature, art, and popular imagination in ways that would resonate for generations. Stories of mysterious princes who might or might not be legitimate heirs captured public fascination, reflecting deeper anxieties about identity, legitimacy, and social order that characterized the transition from medieval to early modern society. These narratives provided frameworks for exploring questions about the nature of kingship itself and the foundations upon which political authority ultimately rested. The psychological dimensions of extended deception, as demonstrated by Warbeck's ability to maintain his false identity for years rather than months, revealed new insights into human adaptability and the malleable nature of personal identity. Contemporary observers noted how thoroughly he seemed to inhabit his assumed royal persona, raising uncomfortable questions about whether prolonged performance might eventually become indistinguishable from reality in the performer's own mind. If someone could so completely become a prince through training and practice, what did that suggest about the supposedly inherent qualities that justified royal rule? The diplomatic precedents established during this period of intensified royal imposture had lasting implications for international relations throughout early modern Europe. The recognition extended by legitimate monarchs to questionable claimants created legal and political complications that would influence succession disputes for decades to come. The use of pretenders as diplomatic weapons demonstrated how questions of dynastic legitimacy could be weaponized in international conflicts, providing relatively inexpensive ways for kingdoms to destabilize their enemies without resorting to direct military confrontation. As Warbeck's conspiracy matured and prepared to test its strength against Tudor defenses, the stage was set for confrontations that would prove far more complex and consequential than the straightforward military campaign that had ended Lambert Simnel's brief reign. The lessons learned from that earlier failure had been absorbed by both sides, creating conditions for a prolonged struggle that would test not only military capabilities but political acumen, diplomatic skill, and the very foundations of royal legitimacy. In an age where identity remained fluid and truth could be as malleable as human ambition and royal desperation demanded. Erasure demanded. The confrontation between Perkin Warbeck and Henry VII would unfold not through a single decisive battle, but through a series of carefully orchestrated moves and counter-moves that stretched across nearly a decade. Unlike Lambert Simnel's brief and spectacular campaign, Warbeck's challenge to Tudor authority resembled a chess match played on a continental scale, where each side sought to position their pieces for maximum advantage, while denying their opponents the quick victory that might end the game decisively. Warbeck's first major attempt to assert his claims came through Scotland, where he found an eager ally in King James IV. The Scottish monarch, perpetually at odds with his English neighbor, saw enormous strategic value in supporting a pretender who might either overthrow Henry VII entirely or at least create sufficient instability to advance Scottish interests along the disputed border regions. The alliance that developed between the young pretender and the Scottish court was far more sophisticated than any support Lambert Simnel had received, involving not just military assistance but genuine diplomatic recognition of Warbeck's royal status. The wedding that James IV arranged between Warbeck and Lady Catherine Gordon, a Scottish noblewoman of impeccable lineage, represented a masterpiece of political theater that elevated the pretender's status throughout European courts. Here was a recognized monarch formally acknowledging the supposed Duke of York's legitimacy by accepting him as a suitable husband for a member of the Scottish royal family. The ceremony itself was conducted with all the pomp and circumstance appropriate for authentic royalty, creating powerful visual evidence of international acceptance that Henry VII's agents found extremely difficult to counter. The military campaigns that followed this diplomatic triumph revealed both the strengths and limitations of Warbeck's position. Scottish raids across the English border, conducted with the pretender riding alongside James IV's forces, provided opportunities for him to present himself as a rightful English king, returning to reclaim his inheritance. Yet these operations also exposed the fundamental weakness of his support within England itself, as local populations showed little enthusiasm for a claimant who arrived in the company of their traditional Scottish enemies. And so, we reach the end of these remarkable tales of deception and ambition, where common-born dreamers dared to claim the most precious prize in medieval Europe, the crown itself. Tonight, we've journeyed through a world where identity was as malleable as warm wax, where a convincing story and unwavering confidence could transform a peasant's son into a king's nephew, at least for a while. From Lambert Simnel's brief but spectacular reign as the crowned King of Ireland to Perkin Warbeck's decade-long masquerade as a missing prince, we've seen how the fluid nature of medieval identity created opportunities that ambitious souls simply couldn't resist. These weren't just con artists or desperate opportunists. They were pioneers of reinvention, masters of human psychology who understood that in an age before photographs or fingerprints, the most powerful truth was often the one people wanted to believe. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those shadowy courts where pretenders plotted and schemed, where royal blood could be claimed with nothing more than courage and a well-rehearsed story. Sweet dreams, and remember that sometimes the most fascinating chapters of history are written not by those born to greatness, but by those bold enough to steal it.